Good evening, and welcome to SkepTalk, the monthly speaker series hosted by the Bay Area Skeptics. Before tonight's presentation, a few words about Bay Area Skeptics. As North America's oldest skeptical organization, we are dedicated to promoting critical thinking, logic, and rational thought. In the 1970s and 80s, scientists such as Carl Sagan and magicians such as James Randi established the scientific skepticism movement out of concern about the popular fondness for pseudoscience and the lack of public science literacy. Scientific skepticism embraces evidence-based civil discourse on health, education, consumer protection, and especially the investigation of extraordinary claims. Using the scientific method, we hope to promote skeptical inquiry to reduce irrational thinking in society. This talk is supported by Bay Area Skeptics members such as you. Please visit us at baskeptics.org or join us on Facebook, Twitter, and Meetup. Consider supporting us through convenient monthly donations via Patreon. Patrons receive premiums such as discounts and free t-shirts for our annual Skeptical Conference. But more importantly, members help us make the world just a little more reasonable and rational. And now, tonight's speaker.
Good evening. My name is Jay Diamond and I'm with Bay Area Skeptics. I'd like to welcome you to our June SkepTalk recording on June 9th, 2022. As we come out of a pandemic, are in the midst of an infodemic, and as the primetime coverage of the January 6th committee begins, you're in for a talk tonight that could not be more timely. Our speaker tonight is Lee McIntyre. Dr. McIntyre is a research fellow at the Center for Philosophy and History of Science at Boston University and an instructor in ethics at Harvard Extension School. He earned his PhD from the University of Michigan at Ann Arbor, and in addition to a very long list of teaching awards at numerous prestigious institutions, he was formerly executive director of the Institute of Quantitative Social Science at Harvard University. Dr. McIntyre has authored a number of books, including several scholarly books on the philosophy and history of science, with a recent move to sharpening his pencil at the dispelling of misinformation, including some of his more recent books are Respecting Truth, Post-Truth, and The Scientific Attitude. His latest nonfiction book is How to Talk to a Science Denier. This caught my attention a few months ago, and I voraciously consumed it. When skeptics get a book on science communication, we begin being, well, skeptical, as one would expect. I quickly discovered that this was a fascinating and well-researched examination of the topic, and sits on my bookshelf next to many works by leaders in the field, including people that are referenced in his book, including Carol Tavris, Mick West, and of course, Carl Sagan. Although I didn't know Lee when picking up the book, it's clear that he's one of us, a true skeptic and a great mind in critical thinking. Bay Area Skeptics welcomes our June SkepTalk speaker, Dr. Lee McIntyre. Welcome, Dr. McIntyre.
Oh, thank you so much. That's wonderful. Yes, absolutely. And thanks, Jay. That please do that introduction again. That was wonderful.
I'll do it again at the end. How's that?
Thanks very much.
Thank you so much for joining us tonight and peeling yourself and our guests that are watching on YouTube away from the January 6th Commission.
Yep.
And making us look at the bigger picture of what we need to do in society to try and talk to science deniers. Take it away, Dr. McIntyre.
Thank you very much. My talk tonight is called How to Talk to a Science Denier. There is some relationship between, I think, all forms of denial. So just keep that in mind as I'm talking about science denial, and think about other forms of denial that you might like to address as well. But tonight I want to talk to you about how to defend science from science deniers by giving scientists and science communicators some better tools to push back. Now, you might say, what better tool is there than scientific evidence? I mean, how do you convince somebody better than that? But here's the problem. I mean, as we all know in this day and age, you really can't convince somebody who doesn't hold their beliefs based on good evidence by giving them more evidence. That's called the information deficit model, and it works with your scientific colleagues, but it really doesn't work with science deniers. So we need to be a bit more strategic. And I want to start with what the research tells us. Some people are quite worried about something called the backfire effect. This was based on an article by Brendan Nine and Jason Riefler in 2010. And they did some work which found that if you provided correcting information for false beliefs, it was very difficult to convince people to change their mind. They did their work with partisans, and it was about political topics. But then, interestingly, they found this perverse effect. Not only that in some cases was it difficult to get people to change their minds, but with some of the most partisan, hardest core people, they not only didn't change their minds, but providing the correcting evidence caused them to double down on their original belief. And that's really crazy, right? Because if they're, how could it be that countervailing evidence made them more likely to hold the false belief? But that's what they found. Now, recent studies have shown that the backfire effect, that second part of what was called the backfire effect, was irreproducible, which is no embarrassment. It doesn't mean that there was any fraud or malfeasance involved. It just means that it was a small effect, a bit of a unicorn that was not able to be repeated. And that is great news, because what that means is that you are not making things worse by talking to somebody and trying to correct their mistaken beliefs. If the backfire effect were real, then you might think, oh no, right? I in trying to correct somebody, I might be causing them to double down on their beliefs. But that is not what's going to happen. The worst that's going to happen is that you won't convince the person to change their mind. But that's a risk. Even if you don't talk to them, they might not change their mind. As one commentator in the debate put it, we're fact resistant, but we're not fact immune. The next study that I want to talk about is over the summer of 2019, there was a study in Nature Human Behavior by Cornelia Batch and Philip Schmid, which provided the first empirical evidence to show that we could effectively talk to science deniers, that it was possible in some cases to get them to overcome their mistaken beliefs. Great news. The study was done online with about 1,700 subjects in the United States and Germany. And what they did is they exposed people to a false message, incorrect information about science. And then they immediately debunked it. Now, interesting that even though they immediately debunked it, some of the people still believed it. Okay, so that's to show you the danger of providing somebody with false information, because even when you immediately take it back, for some people, it's just too late. But what they found was that in a statistically significant number of cases, you could overcome that bad information. And there were two ways. The first, which is no surprise, is something that they called content rebuttal. This you had to be a specialist in the area to do. So say the false information was something about climate. Well, if you're a climatologist, then you're prepared to rebut whatever the false information is, and that it didn't always work. But what they showed is that a statistically significant number of cases, it did work. The real intrigue, though, was the second method. And so the first method is called content rebuttal. The second method is called technique rebuttal. And the brilliant thing about technique rebuttal is it's open to everyone. You don't have to be a specialist. You don't have to be a scientist. Or say you're a climatologist, but how do you talk to somebody about vaccines? You can do that too, right, with technique rebuttal. And this was based on some earlier work that was done by the Hufnagel brothers, and then also later work by John Cook and Stephen Lewandowski, the eminent cognitive scientists, who found that every science denier reasons in the same way. There was a kind of a blueprint, a flawed blueprint, but a blueprint nonetheless, which demonstrated that whether you were an anti-vaxxer or a climate denier or a flat earther or an evolution denier, they all hit the exact same 5 points. And those are these. Number one, they cherry pick evidence. Number two, they believe in conspiracy theories. Number three, they rely on fake experts and discredit real experts. Number four, they engage in illogical reasoning. And number five, this is my favorite, they insist that science has to be perfect. Okay, and I'll say a little bit more about that idea later. Beichenschmidt's idea was that if you learn these 5 tropes, that's enough. In a statistically significant number of cases, you could use that to push back. And the way you do it with technique rebuttal is you don't talk about the facts. You talk about how they're reasoning about the facts, how they got to the facts. Were they using conspiracy theories? Were they relying on fake experts? And Beichenschmidt found that both forms of rebuttal worked equally well, and there was no additive effect. More good news, because it means that you don't have to do both. You can pick your poison, right? And it means that lay people can be just as effective as scientists in doing this. So that I thought that was very good news. I joke with my friends that I could have read that study if my hair were on fire, because this was the first empirical evidence to show that you could convince science deniers. And I'd been studying science denial for about 10 years at that point. Okay, now some bad news. Again, not a flaw in the study, just some things that they found that were a little, we wish the world were different. Let me put it that way. The study showed that we can only mitigate, not overturn, the exposure to scientific myths and disinformation. This is what I was talking about earlier, right? Once you present somebody with false information, a certain number of them are just going to believe it. What that means is that the best possible thing is for them not to be exposed to the bad information in the first place. And Beichenschmidt make that point in their study. They say if you're invited to a debate with a science denier, cancel at the last minute if it means that the debate will be canceled, because even if you show up and do brilliantly, a certain number of people are going to walk away from that debate believing the science denier. Now, the worst possible thing is for you to cancel and then the debate goes on without you, with an empty chair, because then the liar has the microphone. So you've got to show up to defend yourself, right? To defend science. But, and they said this is a joke about canceling at the last minute. The point is, don't give a platform to a science denier, because even if you think you're mopping the floor with them, some people are going to be taken in by what they say. So the point to remember here is, in talking to a science denier, isn't just to debunk false information once it's out there. It's to keep people from hearing misinformation in the first place. Now, let me talk about a couple more limitations with the study. These are not things they discussed in the study. These are just me as a philosopher, as a methodologist. I thought, I wish they had covered, a few other things in the study. Here are 2 things that I worried about. First was time proximity. The study only dealt with debunking a false message the minute somebody had it. But what about overturning beliefs when you get there too late, right? When it's not just that the person had just heard the message, but when they'd heard it and had that message reinforced. In fact, some people, and we all know this because we've all got this person as a brother-in-law, some people have been marinating in scientific disinformation for a decade. So it's not a matter of them just hearing the false information and then debunking it immediately, but they've heard the false information again and again and again. And so I started to wonder, could content rebuttal and technique rebuttal work for the hardcore? Could it work for people who have just are the true believers in that disinformation? Second thing that I worried about with this study is the fact that it was only done online. But and I understand why studies are done online, of course, but most times that we encounter a science denier in the wild, it's in person. It's across the Thanksgiving table. It's, in a debate somewhere on the street. I mean, this is when it happens. And so I started to wonder, could content rebuttal and technique rebuttal work in person? In fact, maybe could they even work better in person? So, I mean, it's not a limitation of the study, it's an extension of the study. And I began to wonder whether that was something that might be possible. Now, here's where we outrun the literature, because that experiment has not been done yet. And I did contact Cornelia Beach at one point, just as COVID was, coming on, and say, could we do this experiment? We haven't gotten back together and talked about it. But, at this point, we outrun the literature, and I wondered what to do. And I went to the anecdotal literature. And I know that the anecdotal literature doesn't have scientific value in the sense that it's not peer reviewed. But sometimes people get their ideas for what to study with peer review from the anecdotal literature. And I started to study this in a serious way to see, were there examples of hardcore deniers who had changed their mind? And if so, what is it that led them to this? And the more I read, the more I realized that this was possible. And in fact, that every case was the same. Now, I had to be careful of confirmation bias here. Was I just looking at the cases that fit the model that I thought was true? But, I was, again, I'm a methodologist. I was pretty careful in doing this reading and realized that there were some things that these cases of people overturning their beliefs had in common. Engagement was what they seemed to have in common. That when you were overcoming somebody's beliefs, you were not just fulfilling the information deficit. You weren't just sharing facts with them. It was crucial how you shared those facts. And the format. Here I want to tell two quick stories. Oh, by the way, the best possible way, I thought, was to do it in person, because all the cases I was reading of people, hardcore deniers who'd overcome their belief, it was done in person by somebody that they trusted, right? And think about it, you build trust in person. So let me make haste to a couple of quick stories. One was from Clark County, Washington, just over the border from Portland, Oregon, my hometown. And they were having a serious vaccine crisis there, a measles outbreak in 2014. Vancouver was number of anti-vax, heavily anti-vax community, as it is in Portland as well. And so that's where there was a measles outbreak in 2014. And you can read all about this story, again, in the anecdotal literature. There was a story in the Washington Post called, if you Google the phrase, it will take off like wildfire, Washington Post, it'll come up. And what happened is Governor Jay Inslee of Washington sent public health officials down to Vancouver to talk to people one-on-one. And guess what? It worked. Now, I'm not saying it worked in every case, but if you read the anecdotal literature, you'll find that there are cases of a number of people who changed their mind and say things like, the scientist was so warm and I trusted him. And he, one person commented on a scientist who took out his whiteboard and explained cell division to her and talked to her for 2 hours, at the end of which she said she was going to vaccinate her kids. Now, we don't all have 2 hours laying around, but the point is this: it works. Okay, that was something that I found very interesting, and see if we can scale up from there. Second story that I want to tell you is another quick one. This one is actually my favorite. Jim Bridenstine was a rock-ribbed conservative Republican member of Congress who gave a speech on the floor of the U.S. House one time that was a climate denier speech. He said all the things that climate deniers say. And so, of course, when Trump came to office, what do you do with a guy like that? He promoted him and made him the head of NASA, which is the leading scientific organization in the world to study climate change. So, who are you going to put in charge of that? Jim Bridenstine. Interesting thing happened. Jim Bridenstine was head of NASA for less than 2 months, and he changed his mind on climate change and said so publicly. He gave a speech in which he said, climate change is real. I was wrong. We're the cause of it. We need to do something about it. Now, what happened? Why did this happen? I personally think the reason that it happened is because he'd met the scientists. They weren't just the evil scientists that he was polarized against and hearing all this misinformation about. He knew them by their first name. He was hanging out in the halls. He was having lunch with them. He was their boss. And he learned that scientists are pretty warm and trustworthy people. And I think that's what ultimately changed his mind. Even empirical beliefs can be tribal. Beliefs are about more than facts and evidence. Sometimes they're about trust and identity and values. And what that means is that we've got really our work cut out for us in talking to science deniers, because when you're trying to change somebody's mind, you're really changing who they are. I mean, it's not just what they believe, it's who they are. You're asking them to change their identity. So, that's a kind of a ticklish thing. And with hardcore deniers, context matters a lot. Face to face, I think, is best, and it, you can at least get them to listen. I'll tell you what doesn't work, and there is empirical data to back this up, also by Brendan Nye and Jason Riefler, by the way. Don't yell at them. Don't insult them. Treat them with respect. I mean, that's just common sense, isn't it? But there's empirical data to show that will not help you to change somebody's mind. So does that mean that the opposite might help you change somebody's mind? Again, you have to do a scientific study, and I don't want to violate the contrapositive. Their logicians know what I'm talking about, but you've got to study that. You've got to test that. Okay. The overall point that I want to make then is that you need to learn to listen. If you want to convince a science denier to change his or her mind, they have to feel heard. You have to be patient. You have to be calm. You have to show them respect, not respect for their beliefs, but respect for them as a person, to be able to say, look, I disagree with you. I think you're wrong, but let's talk it out. That's irresistible sometimes, and you can get into some pretty good conversations. And here I want to start to tell you about one of my own personal experiences where I tried this. Now, I tried this before the Bache-Schmidt study had come out. So maybe, again, motivated reasoning, right? It came out, hey, that's just what I did. But what I did, because I already knew about the technique rebuttal, the 5 steps, the 5 tropes of science denial reasoning, because I had read Cook and Lewandowski, I went to the Flat Earth International Conference in Denver, Colorado in November 2018. I bought the badge, I put on the lanyard, I got rid of my button-down shirt, and I put on a flannel shirt, and I went. And I mingled in that crowd, 650 flat earthers, who were dead serious, by the way. You may think, people said, oh, they're just fooling around. They are not. They're dead serious. I spent the first day with my mouth shut. I just listened. I didn't lie to anybody. But sometimes people would say things like, so Lee, how'd you get interested in flat Earth? And I'd say, well, it's a fascinating topic. Or they'd say, well, what's your point of view? I'd say, well, I'm a skeptic. Ah, me too. See, that's the other thing about science deniers. They think of themselves as skeptics. So I said, I'm a skeptic because I am. And, then we could get into a conversation about that later, but not on the first day. Now, my goal was to hear what they had to say, to listen, to show my face out there, but also to gather some intel to see how they were reasoning, because I couldn't do content rebuttal on flat Earth. And by the way, unless you're a physicist, neither can you. You think you can, but I defy you to go into the ballroom and with what's in your pockets right on the spot, convince them with facts. It's very tough to do. Even if you're out in a ship, right? It's going to be very tough for you to do. And the other thing is they were ready for that. They had studied Newton. They had studied Aristarchus and Galileo. They knew all the literature and they had talking points on it. So how was I ever going to make any progress on that? So instead I thought, look, I'm a philosopher. I'm going to talk to him about logic. I'm going to talk to him about reasoning. Not what do you believe, but why do you believe it? And so what I did was I got them to think about the role that evidence played in their thinking, which I caught a break here, because to a person, when I said, well, so are your beliefs based on faith? And a number of them were evangelical Christians, so that wasn't, a dumb question. They would say, oh, no, I'm a Christian, but my belief is completely based on faith. And, on evidence. And a number of the quote unquote scientific seminars were about the alleged evidence for flat Earth and the evidence against the global Earth. And so this was the quote unquote evidence that they had. So I asked him a question, and I borrowed this question from Karl Popper. Okay, so you believe in flat Earth based on evidence. So answer me this. what evidence would it take, if I had it in my back pocket right now, to convince you that you were wrong? And they really couldn't answer that. And remember that fifth trope? They think that science has to be perfect. I'm basically saying, if I could be perfect and give you exactly what you wanted, would it change your mind? And what would that perfect thing be? I was giving them a real slow softball across the plate. They couldn't answer me. But I got them to think about it because, I mean, just think about it now. If their belief's based on evidence and they can't tell me what evidence could change their mind, then is their belief really based on evidence? I don't think so. And I let them sit with that contradiction for a moment. So I was out there trying technique rebuttal before, it was in the Bache and Schmidt study. Why was I doing this? My working theory was that flat Earth was the same as all other science denial. I mean, I knew this from the earlier work that somebody else had done. And my reasoning was that if all science denial was the same, then if I could learn how to talk to a flat earther, I could learn how to talk to a climate denier or an anti-vaxxer or any others. And so I was there because I thought of flat earthers as the worst science deniers on the planet, and I was going to have at it. And I wrote about this in my book, How to Talk to a Science Denier. It's the first chapter. And of course, I was also concerned that flat earthers use these conventions to recruit new members. I've got to say, by the time somebody comes to a flat earth convention, they're pretty hardcore. Most of them are recruited through YouTube videos. They start out thinking, oh, how hard could this be, to refute it. And then they watch 20 videos and they think, oh, I didn't find a flaw in that. I guess flat earth is right. And then they come to the convention and then they get radicalized in the community, and a lot of belief is social. And so that's what happens. But I was undeterred. I wanted to take on the hardcore. And so the second day I came out. Yeah, I've been here the last day, but I'm a philosopher and I think you're wrong and I'd like to talk to you. And I would grab speakers just as they came off stage and try to talk to them when we had a crowd, try to have a little mini debate. I wasn't going to hurt, because the backfire effect isn't real. Plus, I was having a debate with only flat earthers listening. So, what was the worst that was going to happen? They were going to be reinforced in their beliefs, but I wanted to see if I could do it. I tell a lot of these stories in the book. I'll just tell you one right now. My best conversation was with a guy who had just given a talk on how to recruit people into flat earth. Now, this was catnip. He would stand out on the corner with a sign, "Earth is flat, ask me how," and run street clinics, and get ridiculed, yelled at, disrespected. And he was a great debater. He was a smart guy. And I thought, okay, this is the guy I want to talk to. So he came off stage and I said who I was. And I said, how about I take you to dinner? And great, he went. And we had 2 hours. We had a 2-hour dinner. And the technique, and he said, well, I'm going to try to convince you. I said, great. So I had a lot of fun. No notes, no recording. I didn't want to mess up the conversation. And I started with my hardest question. What would it take? You believe in evidence, right? Absolutely. What would it take to convince you that you were wrong? Now, he was a very sharp guy. And so he immediately knew he had to answer that question. That was not just a trivial question. He couldn't walk away. This was it. Right. I didn't know how he was going to get mad and walk away. So I asked my hardest question first. We didn't even have our appetizers yet. And first he said, well, I guess I'd have to go up in a rocket. And then he said, no, wait a minute. The windows might be curved. Because remember, they're conspiracy theorists, right? And I said, okay. And again, I just was quiet. I just let him think for a minute. He couldn't come up with anything. And I finally said, look, I just got out of a seminar where they talked about how Antarctica wasn't a real continent. He said, that's right. And I said, so you think that there could be but the flat earthers, by the way, believe that Antarctica is not a continent. It's a mountain range spread out across the perimeter of the earth that keeps the water from falling off. And then there's a dome over the top. And then the sun, moon, and stars are just outside the dome. So that means that there are no flights over Antarctica. And I said, so why don't we fly over Antarctica? And he said, can't be done. There isn't any flight over Antarctica. And in my back pocket, I pulled it out. Aha. here's a flight from Santiago, Chile to Auckland, New Zealand. And he said, have you been on that flight? And I said, no, let's go. He said, I can't afford that. I said, I'll fundraise, I'll pay for you. And he agreed. He leaned across and shook my hand. And I thought, okay, my friends in the skeptic community, we're going to do a, GoFundMe for this. And, and I told the guy, you can bring your camera, you can do experiments, you can open the windows, shut the windows, whatever you want to do. But then I said, wait a minute, we need a criteria. And he said, what do you mean? I said, look, I don't want to get back and have you say the windows were curved. Okay. So we need a criteria. And I said, if I'm right, then Antarctica is about 1,000 miles across, 1,500 miles across, which means that we should be able to go on that flight on one tank of fuel. But if you're right, then Antarctica is 24,000 miles and we could never get there on one tank of gas. So why don't we, even with the windows shut, agree right now that our criteria is that if we have to stop to refuel, then you're right. But if we don't have to stop to refuel, then I'm right. Shook my hand again. And I thought, great, I'm going over Antarctica. 30 seconds later, he took it back. And I said, I was very disappointed. And I said, why? And he said, well, that maybe it was impossible. Maybe no plane ever had to stop for to refuel. And I said, what do you mean planes stop to refuel all the time? And he said, well, maybe that's a hoax. I said, wait a minute. You're telling me that the entire history of aviation, since before you and I were born, they've been stopping planes to refuel as a hoax against the day when I would be sitting here with you tonight, trying to convince you to take this flight with me to prove to you that the earth was round. And he said, yes. Now, effectively at that point, the conversation was over, right? But we didn't even have our, entrees yet. I mean, we kept talking, but I mean, he was smart enough to realize that the moment of truth had come and gone, and he couldn't admit it. But he never did get back to me with what evidence would satisfy him. And I mean, we parted as friends, I mean, as much as we could. I made a mistake. I didn't keep up with him. I should have taken his information and kept up with him, because that's another thing in talking to science deniers. Very hard to get them to admit they're wrong, tear off their lanyard, what a fool I was. But over time, especially as they begin to trust you, maybe that's going to work. So I blew it. I should have done that. I didn't get anybody there to admit that they were wrong. I felt it was a victory to get them to listen, because in order to listen, they had to trust me. And my goal was to be there to build trust, and you build trust face to face. And, I felt that I had some sort of a platform at that point. So look, what I did was radical to go to a flat earth convention. I'm not recommending that everybody do that. But what I am saying is that everybody can talk to the science denier in their life. We all know a science denier. We can do something about it. And I've heard a lot of scientists say, well, it's not worth my time. Or they'll say, it would never work anyway. At which point I say, what are you, a denialist yourself? Because Bates and Schmidt showed that it could work. I mean, are you going to deny that their study was well done? I mean, look, scientists have a role to play here. And I published a piece in American Journal of Physics, and I did another one can't remember, I think it was in Scientific American, where I can't remember where the other one was, where I argued that we need to get more scientists doing this, because remember content rebuttal, right? Or even that scientists can do technique rebuttal as well. It is worth arguing with these people. We need an army of people doing it, in fact. And here I just want to make in closing, just a couple of quick remarks. It'll only be a few more minutes about the stakes and what our future will look like if we don't get a handle on this problem. Science deniers used to be the person in the tinfoil hat standing out on the corner with the mimeograph sheet saying we didn't go to the moon. By the way, flat earthers don't think we've been to the moon either, because we can't get past the dome. But science denial is now organized, okay? The internet allows people to create a campaign of doubt along anything they want. And most importantly, to find a group of supporters who believe the same thing that they believe. They can now recruit thousands, if not millions of people. 7% of the population of Brazil believes that the earth is flat. That's 11 million people. I mean, so flat earth, I mean, I don't know if there are any statistics about this. There's a new book called Off the Edge that I haven't had a chance to read yet. Maybe there are some statistics. I'm not aware of any myself, but it's more widespread than you think. You probably met a flat earther. They just don't tend to tell people in polite company that they're flat earthers unless they're standing on the corner with a sign. Most science denial is not based on misinformation, but disinformation. It's not a mistake, it's a lie. Now, the exception here is probably flat earth, because I can never figure out who's making any money on it, who's behind it, what interest is being served. But think about anti-vax. Think about climate denial. There are moneyed interests behind those. There are political interests. There are ideological interests behind evolution denial. There are reasons that people want other people to disbelieve the facts about a scientific topic. And it's because it benefits them financially, ideologically, politically. And so people put money into this. They share disinformation, intentionally false information, to try to get the people to believe it. So what I'm doing, talking to the science deniers, is talking to people once they've already been infected, right? Once they've already received the bad information. But so there are other ways to fight this, right? To go after the disinformers or the amplifiers of disinformation in the first place. But here's the thing. The people who are the believers, they're victims. They didn't come up with these ideas on their own. Nobody wakes up one day and says, maybe there are microchips in my vaccine, or, I bet the California wildfires were started by a Jewish space laser. Somebody told them that. Somebody lied to them about that. They told them that for a very important reason. Very quickly, I'll tell you, the thing about the microchips in the vaccine, that was due to a Russian disinformation campaign due to Russian intelligence. They published an article in one of their English language propaganda arms called Oriental Review in April 2020. Now think about what was going on with the pandemic in April 2020. They published an article which said that any future Western vaccines would have microchips, tracking microchips in them. This was before Pfizer and Moderna was even invented. At the bottom of the article, it said, click on Facebook, click on Twitter, share on Facebook, share on Twitter. By May 2020, 44% of Republican voters believed that any future vaccines would have microchips in them. What was the Russians' interest in this? Putin has had a long-standing war against American science. There's an article on this in 2019 in the New York Times called Putin's Long War Against American Science, about HIV/AIDS, about GMOs, about climate. He wants to destabilize Western societies, so he's attacking our truth-telling institutions, and science is an important one. So that's just one example of how most science denial is due to disinformation. So the problem here is, while we're talking to these science deniers, we need to also remember where this disinformation is coming from, expose where it's coming from, but also realize that one of the big dangers is that it's being amplified on social media. And so we have to figure out what to do about that as well. There was a study by the Center for Countering Digital Hate, which found that 65% of the anti-vax propaganda on Twitter was due to a dozen people. A small number of people with a microphone, not a mimeograph machine, but the microphone that is social media, can do a tremendous amount of damage. And meanwhile, a number of our fellow citizens have gone down this rabbit hole. So we have to fight all of it. We have to help the people who are already infected with the bad information because they're victims. But we also need to figure out what we can do about fighting the creation and the dissemination and the amplification and dissemination of disinformation as well. These people are our family and friends. they always say don't discuss religion and politics at the dinner table. Maybe I'll give them that because it's values questions. You're going to convince anybody anyway. But we're talking here about factual matters. And I can't help but realize that I'm talking to you on the night of the first televised public proceedings, the January 6th commission. Science denial is the blueprint for election denial. The 5 tropes that I gave you earlier about science denial, think about it. Illogical reasoning, reliance on conspiracy theories, reliance on fake experts. It's the same. It's the same blueprint. So if we don't figure out what to do about this problem, we're in trouble, not just about science, but about other topics that we potentially care about as well. That's where I'll end.
Thank you, Lee. That was fascinating, really fascinating. About 5 years ago, my litmus test for whether you would believe anything was homeopathy.
Mm-hmm.
And homeopathy was, one of those things that was debunked like 100 years ago.
Right.
Then we get to flat Earth. And I think, wasn't this debunked like 1,000 years ago? And it's mind-blowing to me that this is such a huge growing trend.
It is, and the thing to remember about it is that it creates a sense of identity. It creates a sense of belonging. And think of science denial this way. It's not that they have doubts, because doubts can be overcome with fact. It's that they have distrust.
Right.
Science deniers are convinced that they're being lied to. And they're conspiracy theorists, so they think that the people who are lying to them are organized. Think about all the anti-vax that we just lived through, about how Fauci had invented COVID, or he was making money on the vaccines, or this, or their masks. So this is an organized campaign of denial. The disinformation doesn't just create false facts; it polarizes us and teaches us to hate and distrust people who believe the truth. And so when you look at it that way, it's maybe not so shocking. Now, it is, of course, shocking, and we should never get over that people believe that the earth is flat. But I also heard other things like that the royal family are lizard people.
Sure. And,
other things that how could anybody possibly believe that? And it, could be debunked, immediately. But it's not, because when you try to share a fact with somebody and they don't trust you, why should they believe the fact?
Yeah.
So I'm trying to strike at the heart of what's really at issue, which is distrust. You show up face to face, you show them that you're a fairly reasonable person. You may even have something in common on another topic. Maybe they listen.
My big takeaway from your book, and I've read a number of books on this subject, but my big takeaway from your book that I didn't quite pick up elsewhere was every science denier reasons the same way.
Yes.
And then you do a great job of breaking down those 5 tropes, and I found that really fascinating.
It helps. And again, I didn't do that research. I'm drafting on somebody else's research, but it helps because it breaks down the problem to something manageable, because it means Absolutely. That you don't have to, so I'm going into a conversation with somebody who's an evolution denier, and I'm trying to remember, my Darwin, and, maybe I'm pretty solid on that, but I don't know some of the studies they're bringing up. And what can I say? But then I can say, well, but why do you believe that? Who came up with that? And it turns out the person's a fake expert. And then, I'm going to bore down. So then they're on my turf. Because if I'm doing technique rebuttal, I've been to philosophy grad school. I know how to do this, right? And so that's, and I think that's a lesson for science communicators, because one thing that holds people up is they think, well, I just don't have the scientific knowledge to go out and do it. You don't need it. It's good to have it. I'm not saying you shouldn't have it, but read the Bates and Schmidt study. They even give scripts at the beginning of it of, if they say this, you say this. Here's how to do it. Borrow my question, Popper's question. What evidence could convince you that you were wrong? That was a showstopper. I never did get an adequate answer to that question.
I'll tell you the answer that I've gotten quite a bit on that you didn't touch on, which is,
Yeah.
oh, nothing would change my mind.
Then your belief's not based on evidence.
And who's closed-minded?
Yeah, that's right. And I mean, the thing that I got a lot is people will say, well, you know what would convince me? Proof. And I'd say, you know, I'm disappointed. And they say, why? I say, well, I thought you said you were a scientist and a skeptic. Everybody knows that empirical reasoning can't be, you know, you can't have proof. I mean, didn't you said you're a skeptic. Did you study the problem of induction? And they probably didn't, but they go, oh, yeah, I did. Well, you know, so you know that no matter how good the evidence, I mean, this is not Euclidean geometry. It's not deductive logic. We can't ever close the books. So a good skeptic is not only skeptical of something new, but willing to change their mind when the evidence is sufficient to do so. And that's the part that so-called skeptics don't get, right? I call them cafeteria skeptics. They're skeptical about the things they want to be skeptical about. And they're not true skeptics because they have a double standard, right? They're actually quite gullible. Anything that they want to believe, they don't really need good evidence. If they don't want to believe it, they need proof.
Yeah.
That's not scientific. I wrote an earlier book called The Scientific Attitude, where I kind of said, stop talking about scientific method. Talk about scientific attitude, because it's the attitude that scientists have toward being flexible of mind enough to change their mind on the basis of new evidence. It's that balance, that Sagan idea. They're skeptical and open-minded at the same time.
Yeah.
That's what you need to do.
So now that I've read your most recent book, you're going to cost me a lot of money because I see that you've written all these other books. I had one more question about all those other books before we get to questions from the audience. So you've written a ton of academic books and a ton of academic articles. One of the things that Carl Sagan discusses in Demon Haunted World is his concern about popularizing.
Yes.
And did you have a concern when you started writing more popular books? Can you talk about what was your motivation for doing that? And did you have concerns about that?
You know, it's funny. Sagan brings that up. And I know that Sagan himself was criticized, you know, for this. Absolutely. Because I'm old enough to remember watching Cosmos. This was, I mean, I not only watched Cosmos, I bought the book, you know.
Changed my life.
It was wonderful.
Yeah.
And I remember thinking, why can't all scientists be that clear? I mean, model of good scientific communication. And I mean, the knock against popularization is always, well, you're oversimplifying it. You're not doing, you know, your good work. You're communicating in communicating with the public. Don't you have to dumb it down?
Yes.
And I think you don't. So I don't do two versions of my book. I do one version that's as rigorous as I can be in the clearest possible language. Now, this is something that philosophers are supposed to take to heart. So maybe I didn't get as much pushback as Sagan gets, right? Because philosophers are supposed to care about clarity, though Heidegger said that clarity is suicide for philosophers. You know, so I mean, you know, so you know,
I've
something to
read
hide
a number of philosophy books that are clear but have a lot of jargon and are very wordy. Right.
So I mean, I'm a public philosopher, and there aren't a lot of us, but we're growing, and our goal is to engage on the important topics of our time in language that people can understand, but with still the analytical rigor of being a philosopher. So it's funny, you know, I haven't really gotten a lot of pushback. I expected more than I've gotten.
Wow.
I expected my philosophical colleagues to say, you're dumbing it down. What are you doing? But maybe it's because the employment market is so bad in philosophy that they thought, hey, this is great. You're getting work. But I mean, I'm bringing philosophy out there, and I don't think I'm bastardizing it. It's funny too, because my book Scientific Attitude had some material in it that it was really a challenge to make it as clear as I could, because I was talking about necessary and sufficient conditions and the problem of demarcation and stuff that is hardcore philosophy of science stuff. And so I would have to wend my way around it by having amusing section titles like, the vexing problem of necessary and sufficient conditions. But, I did my best to get people into it. And sometimes you get pushback. What I get mostly is appreciation from people to say, I finally understand philosophy. And the thing is, I think philosophy is wonderful. And it warms my heart to hear people say that they enjoy philosophy, because I think it is really for everyone. I started to become a philosopher when I was 5, when my mom would ask me questions. She never went to college, but she would ask me questions about, well, why do you think it's this way? Why, and I would say, what are the stars? And she'd say, well, they're other suns, but they're just very far away. And I'd say, well, do they have planets? And she'd say, no one knows. How could you not start to wonder about the world? And now I just gave her eulogy. She passed away at the age of 96 a few years ago. And they've now discovered 4,000 exoplanets. So mom was right. There they are. So, you can start, I taught logic to 5th graders one time. You can start philosophy young, make it clear, and it's for everybody, I think.
Well, and one of my favorite books on philosophy of science is Massimo Polidoro's, Massimo Pigliucci's Nonsense on Stilts.
Yes, I've got that one on my shelf too. I know both Massimos.
But I can't. Yes, I know both Massimos. Yes, I can't really recommend that book to most people that I know, because it's hard to read. Your book was not hard to read, but I found it very refreshing that it was so thorough.
Thank you. I enjoy all of Massimo's work. The stuff that's I discuss it, in fact, his work some in Scientific Attitude. But thank you. I appreciate the compliment.
Good. Do we have questions from the audience for Lee? Our first question, let me put on my old man glasses here. Just finished your latest book and thoroughly enjoyed it. I know you aren't a psychologist, but I'm interested to hear your thoughts on mental health and its relation to curbing science denial.
Yeah, I wish. I love psychology, and I don't have any formal training other than some college courses. I don't think that science deniers are mentally ill unless we're all mentally ill, because what I found is that people, as I said, they're cafeteria skeptics. People can be science deniers about, I'm not saying we all are about some topic, because I don't think that's true, but I think there's a healthy percentage of the population that are science deniers about something.
Yes.
And I've given talks where people have come up to me afterward and said, I really enjoyed your talk. Boy, did you stick it to the fossil fuel guys. And I love what you said about big tobacco, but damn it, you're wrong on GMOs. And they'll get veins and they're angry, and I have to be patient and say, I'm sorry, there's never been a study which has shown that GMOs are unsafe to eat. And I know the corporate history of Monsanto, and it's terrible. And I don't condone their business practices, nor do I use glyphosate. But there's a lot of GMOs that are made by other companies. And just because you don't like Monsanto doesn't mean that golden rice is a killer, because it's not. So I get pushback on that. There is a very well-trained and brilliant psychologist named Ashley Landrum from University, I think it's Texas Tech actually, who's got a forthcoming book on flat Earth. So if you're interested in a psychologist's take on science denial, I highly recommend her book, which is not out yet. I've only got a chapter on flat Earth. She's got a whole book. I can't wait to read her book.
Now, I did have one other question about flat Earth since this came up.
Yeah.
You were talking about the monetary goal, the people that are pushing flat Earth. When you were at that conference, did you not see a swag table? Did you not see people pushing their YouTube channel?
Nobody's making a living on it, though. Some people were making pennies. Compared to what the tobacco companies and the fossil fuel companies are doing for denial, I mean,
For sure.
these people, they have a swag fair where they're selling, T-shirts and hats.
Yeah.
Maybe they're making enough money to go to the next conference.
Okay.
They're not. Nobody's making a living on it. Listen, a lot of the flat earthers lose their jobs. They get kicked out of their church, their families. I mean, they're not rolling in dough or taking it on for political or other ideological reasons, as far as I can see. I mean, again, wait for Landern's book. Maybe she's got more insight in it than I do, but that was the one that has always stuck out to me. Like, that one, I can't figure out. Maybe this is just organic, because I can't figure out who's behind this one. I don't know.
Well, and as you indicated earlier, these people are victims. They've been led down a rabbit hole, right?
And it's hard to feel that way sometimes when you're face to face with them, an anti-vaxxer, but it is true.
Yes. Next question, please. Okay, from Emmanuel A10. If people shouldn't be exposed to bad information, doesn't that mean that everything they see should be curated? Doesn't that mean that it's assumed they have no critical thinking?
No. Of course, we do have the ability to fight things off. So I talked about debunking. There's also something called pre-bunking. Pre-bunking is when you have built up your mental immune strength to the point where you can see the disinformation coming and you fend it off, just like your body fends off an illness. I've got a very good friend named Andy Norman who just wrote a book called Mental Immunity. And he argues that this is possible, and that, in fact, that we can develop it through studying critical thinking. He's a philosopher like me. So it's not that we need to protect people from any idea that might be the least bit controversial. It's that it's not good for them to be lied to. And if we can, cut down on the amount, let's do that. I mean, the disease model really works here, right? There's such a thing as viral load, right? Maybe our immune system can fight it off if it's not too bad, but if it's too bad, then, it's going to overwhelm our system. So, I mean, I'm an advocate of Andy's idea about mental immunity. I think that we need to work on that. You can't just never expose anybody to bad information, because sometimes that's how you learn to inoculate yourself. But what you see right now on social media is horrific. I mean, that's swimming in dirty water. You don't learn to swim in dirty water. And
we had John Cook as a guest a few months ago, and he was talking all about pre-bunking. And if you missed that talk, our audience can go see that on our YouTube channel. It's archived.
Yeah, he's one of my faves.
Fantastic. Do we have another question? Question from Ishil. If you were to give one piece of advice to someone who's dealing with deniers and receiving hateful, harassing comments, what would that be?
That's a hard one, because I would say the problem is, remember that it becomes us versus them. And when you don't trust somebody, it's easy to begin to dislike them. And when you dislike them, it's easy to begin to hate them. And when you hate them, then it can degenerate into bad behavior. And I don't think you need to put up with that, because you're never, will you get the, I mean, I shouldn't say that, because right as I say that, I can think of two examples of people who overcame hate to convince hardcore deniers about in this case these were white supremacists to give up their beliefs. I'm thinking of Daryl Davis. I'm thinking of Eli Saslow's book, Rising Out of Hatred. So, I mean, there are people who are braver than me who take on the hate and overcome it. Hate is a difficult one, because one of the main ways to fight disinformation is to deplatform it. So I'm not a big fan of giving hate a platform. And I'm also not a big fan of letting somebody abuse me. I mean, I have to say you have to find your own comfort zone on this. Look, those are not just hardcore believers. It's very tough in that situation. And by the way, I didn't get any of that in any of the conversations I've had with science deniers, because I think that it's really hard to hate somebody if you're face to face. I mean, it's possible, of course, but most of the hate, and I mean, I've gotten hatred, it's always online. It's always online. I mean, that's where people get the hateful, harassing comments. They don't tend to get them face to face. No, I'm not saying, oh, so, go out and find the hateful people and talk to them face to face. That'll work. But damn it, I know people who do it.
Well, I have to say, whether it's you or Mick West, who wrote Escaping the Rabbit Hole, or Mike Marshall, who does the Be Reasonable podcast, not all of us have the temperament to be that reasonable. Well, sometimes it's hard.
I had to walk away. There was one point where I had to walk away. They, in one of those seminars about recruiting people, they started to talk about how to recruit kids.
Oh, yeah.
And that upset me because, and I talk about it in the book a little bit, because to a person, the adults there used to be globalists, which is the nice word they use. But then they watched YouTube videos and they changed their mind. And I thought, well, okay, they're adults. They can change their mind back. But kids, if you're indoctrinating kids, what chance do they have? And as a dad, I was either going to stand up in a ballroom of 200 people and scream bullshit, or I was going to leave. So I left.
Yeah. Fascinating. So, all right, next question, please. All right, a question from Victor. You mentioned in passing the concept of tying ideas to your identity. Personally, it seems like a good inoculation against bad ideas to never put labels on yourself. How do you think of this?
Well, as a skeptic, no, I put a label on myself. Look, tying ideas to your identity. It's sometimes people care more about the identity than they care about the ideas. It's having a team. There's a social aspect to belief. Liliana Mason out of Michigan State did an absolutely brilliant study about political belief, where she found that if you asked partisans how they would feel about living next door to, having your daughter date someone who, et cetera, somebody who was pro-choice or pro-gun control or this or that, person was a conservative, they would squawk at a certain level. But then if you said, how would you feel about living next door to, having your daughter date, et cetera, a Democrat, they exploded. It was the identity that upset them, not the ideology. So even if you added up all of the things that make somebody a Democrat, if you took them just as ideas, as beliefs, it didn't make people as mad as the identity. It's the label that upsets people. Right. The identity, beliefs are fungible. Remember those guys at the Trump rally wearing the shirt that said, "I'd rather be a Russian than a Democrat"? What sort of ideological transposition did they have to make from, good Republican conservative policy of 20 years ago to make that change? Yeah. That was identitarian. That was not ideological. That was identitarian. So to answer the question, would it be a good inoculation not to put an identity label? Maybe so. Maybe so. Because once you realize that denialist beliefs are based on identity, it should make you wonder, does that mean my beliefs are based on identity? And then I think, well, no, because I've got a mechanism that I use to test them based on evidence and the scientific attitude, et cetera, et cetera. But, it's a good question. It's a good question, because what does the identity do for you that the belief doesn't do all by itself? Do you really need the identity label other than to say, I'm not them, I'm this?
But of course, that's what coastal elites like you will always say.
Yeah. Well, think about masking, right? Were there moments when people either did wear a mask or didn't wear a mask for identitarian purposes?
Yeah.
Not a health purpose, but to show I don't want you to think I'm a conservative, so I'm going to wear a mask.
Yep.
Yeah. Sometimes it happens.
All right, next question, please. All right, a question from Mary. How do you manage to not lose hope with all of this? How do you observe what's going on in the world and still find the capacity to fight the good fight? Great question.
I don't know. I can't. Maybe it's something that happened to me in philosophy grad school. I just can't stand it. I've loved science and philosophy since I was a little boy, and all those books you talk about, I'm always defending something that I care about. And you're right, Mary. The problem keeps getting worse and worse. My book, Dark Ages, which was my first public philosophy book, was about why we needed a science of human behavior. And then, because I was trying to extend science to the social sciences. And then they started to attack natural science. And I thought, okay, well, I'll write a book called Respecting Truth. And well, guess what happened after that? They started to attack all factual belief. So I wrote a book called Post-Truth. I mean, how much worse can it get than that? So how do I not lose hope? Because there's something that I can do. I mean, the nice part of being a public philosopher is I'm not just preaching to my class. I've got a platform. I can publish books. I can give talks. I can convince other people that, yes, there's something you can do. There are more people who believe in science than don't. And if all of us could talk to the science deniers in our own life, we could make a huge difference. And in fact, the most encouraging stories are the ones about family members. I mean, the woman I heard about who her father kept telling her about, how climate, he was a climate denier, kept talking about how global warming was a hoax, et cetera, et cetera. And she finally said to him, Dad, you keep quoting all these experts or people that you read on Facebook. Why do you trust them more than your own daughter? But that got through to him, see?
Yeah.
And, I don't know. How do I answer that question? I haven't lost hope. I've got a lot of fight. But the thing is, you don't fight. You engage people. There's something about engagement that really is nice. I can't say it was always comfortable talking to science deniers, but I came away from it thinking I did a good thing today.
Great. I think we have one last question. Maybe? Do we have one last one? Nope, we have no last question.
Okay.
Excellent. Well, Lee, this has been really fascinating. And, as I mentioned to you earlier, I'm a huge fan of philosophy of science and people that dissect that and this whole public philosophy concept. And I loved your book. You're going to cost me a lot of money reading not only your past books, but all of the books from all the people that you mentioned tonight, which were a lot. Now, you've also got a website, right?
Yeah. Anybody who's interested in finding out about my other books or links to my other radio or TV or speeches, podcasts, anything, or my upcoming talks, go to leemcintyrebooks.com. Even got pictures of my dog there. So whatever you want to find out about me is on that website. And thanks for giving me a chance to plug it.
And by the way, I actually listened to your book on Audible while I walked.
Oh, nice.
And it was a great way to digest that book.
I haven't done it yet. I don't even know the voice.
It was well narrated.
Oh, good.
It was very well done. It was
I have. They sent me a copy. I just haven't put it in the machine yet.
It was good enough that I asked you to be a speaker.
Oh, okay. All right. I like that.
So thank you so much, Lee. Really appreciated your talk tonight. Thanks.
Thanks for having me. I appreciated it.
Fantastic. So for our viewers, I just want to remind you that typically we do SkepTalks once a month, but next month we have our annual conference, which is SkepTalk. And if you go to skeptical.com, you can see all of our speakers, buy tickets, all the rest. And we have a little plug here from one of our keynote speakers. Could we run that, please?
Greetings, Bill Nye here. I encourage you to attend SkepTalk 2022, July 16th and 17th. This summer, get it on your electric computer machine and turn it up loud.
So in addition to Bill Nye, in conversation with Jeannie Scott, we also have Stephen Novella, we have Edzard Ernst, and Stephen Novella is, of course, from The Skeptic's Guide to the Universe. If you don't know Edzard Ernst, you're missing out as a skeptic, because he's written my favorite books on skepticism of quackery medicine. We have Nick Little talking about skepticism in the law. He's busy fighting the homeopathy war against CVS in the United States and Walmart. We have Kenny Biddle, who's going to be talking about his transition from a ghost hunter to a real skeptical investigator. It's a fascinating story. We have a couple of amazing panels, one on the comedy of skepticism with a bunch of professional entertainers, and another one that is very similar to the vein that we were talking about tonight, which is engaging with true believers and denialists. And so I think that should be great. In addition, we have Alex Kasprak, who's talking about his experience with Snopes and fighting disinformation. And we have a bunch of fun events like Skeptical Trivia and Skepperty, where our guests, I can announce now, are going to be Bill Nye, Evan Bernstein, and our own Ishil Erikan. So that should be fantastic. If you haven't seen Skepperty from last year, I encourage you to check our YouTube channel. And that is all we've got for you tonight. Please get your tickets for SkepTalk as soon as possible. Ticket prices go up the beginning of next month, so don't wait. Thank you very much. Good night. Stay skeptical.